The 1918 influenza didn't end in 1918. In this 1918 photograph taken in California, volunteer medical caretakers from the American Red Cross keep an eye on flu patients in the Oakland Municipal Auditorium, which was utilized as a transitory clinic. Edward A. Doc Rogers/AP, by Jess McHugh, February 6, 2022. Vertical bar updated February 6, 2022 at 9:40 a.m. EST. In New York City in 1920, almost 2 years into a lethal flu pandemic that would guarantee something like 50 million lives around the world, the new year started on a brilliant note. Best Health Report for City in 53 Years, flaunted a feature in the New York Times on January 4, 1920, after New York had endured 3 decimating floods of the seasonal infection. The country overall, which would eventually lose 675,000 individuals to the illness, accepted that the end could, at last, be in sight. Get the full insight. Pick your arrangement inside half a month. Nonetheless, those hopeful features started to change. Before the month's end, New York City would encounter a flood in flu cases. Chicago and other metropolitan communities announced something very similar. The 1918 influenza is still with us. The deadliest pandemic at any point is as yet bringing on some issues today. Inhabitants ought to set themselves up for a flu return, New York City Well-Being Magistrate Royal S. Copeland cautioned. He anticipated that the infection variation liable for the flood would be milder and that the people who had become sick the earlier year would be invulnerable. He was off base, basically to some extent, while many spots worldwide didn't see a fourth influx of the extraordinary flu pandemic. A few cities, including New York City, Chicago, and Detroit, had one more lethal season coming up. As the COVID pandemic deadheads into its 3rd year and the loss of life in the United States arrive at 900,000, the 1918 flu pandemic can offer some knowledge into how this section of history could attract to a nearby. Be that as it may, and finishing, with regards to infections, for example, these, is a deceptive word. In the long run, specialists say, the novel COVID is probably going to progress from a lethal and problematic microbe to a milder, more occasional irritation. Meanwhile, however, the nation's experience a century prior proposes that we could be in for significantly more torment, particularly assuming we let our gatekeeper down. In this photograph from October 1918, a sign posted at the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia demonstrates this season's virus pandemic, known as Spanish influenza, is very dynamic. U.S. Maritime History and Heritage Command/AP, uncredited/AP, the 1918 influenza endured a long way past 1918. 2 years after it started, similarly as authorities, for example, Copeland was proclaiming triumph and urban communities were facilitating limitations, a 4th wave hit pieces of the nation, bringing rebuffing caseloads that drove a few clinics to the edge of a breakdown and left a lot more American. The infection didn't appear to be so threatening when it started. The primary wave in the spring of 1918 was moderately gentle. In any case, it got back furiously in the fall, presumably having transformed. That second wave consumed patients all over the planet. Road vehicles were changed over into hearses, and clerics gathered bodies with horse-drawn carriages. During the second wave alone, a greater number of Americans were dispensed with by seasonal influenza than passed on in the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War consolidated. A stellar influenza was seething. In any case, in 1918, U.S. authorities overlooked the emergency to battle a conflict. Influenza pandemic appeared to influence youngsters specifically, because of reasons that students of history and researchers are as yet discussing. At the point when the main recorded cases showed up, World War I was seething, and the confined states of the channels implied that the infection could pass quickly from one fighter to another, and the circumstances and field clinics frequently rushed the spread. Different specialists have recommended that individuals in their 20s and 30s were more averse to having earlier insusceptibility to comparative seasonal infections. Notwithstanding, the infection alone brought down the future in the United States by over 12 years. Upwards of 10% of all youthful grown-ups living through the hour of this season's virus pandemic might have passed on from it, as per antiquarian John M. Barry in his book The Great Influenza. By the colder time of the year of 1919 to 1920, Americans were exhausted of the constraints on day-to-day existence. Essentially all of the general well-being limitations, for example, cover wearing, social separating, and the conclusion of schools and places of worship, had been lifted. A hurried revisitation of public get-together prompted an expansion in the event that numbers. Legislators either faulted individuals' imprudence for the reappearance of the infection or minimized the earnestness of it. The fourth wave was not headline news in the manner that earlier spikes had been. The inclusion was frequently consigned to little passages somewhere inside papers, detailing a large number of new cases on a week-by-week or even consistent schedule. By February 1920, there was a pestilence in state jail in New Jersey, and a few courts had to end procedures as a result of ailment. One doctor composed a letter to the proofreader in the New York Times in the colder time of year of 1920, asking individuals to keep away from unnecessary openness to flu through pointless social contact. The specialist cautioned that any individual who visited somebody who was poorly was then at that point equipped for spreading the illness to quite a few other people who could have gotten away. In this manner putting an additional channel upon the all-around overburdened medical clinics, attendants, and specialists. We heard the bells, the influenza of 1918. In this selection from a 2010 narrative, Americans share what it resembled to survive the 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed an expected 50 million around the world. U.S. Branch of Health and Human Services. Yet, on the off chance that the fourth wave neglected to produce the sorts of features and anxiety toward its ancestors, it wasn't really for an absence of lethality. In New York City, more individuals kicked the bucket in the period from December 1919 to April 1920 than in the first and third waves, as indicated by an exploration paper on flu mortality in the city. Detroit, St. Louis, and Minneapolis likewise experienced huge fourth waves, and serious overabundance mortality was accounted for in numerous regions in Michigan as a result of this season's virus. Ben Franklin's unpleasant lament that he didn't vaccinate his 4-year-old child against smallpox. Neighborhood state-run administrations' general well-being medications really may have added to the fourth wave by restricting the infection's spread in earlier waves. Allowing the infection to spin out of control, notwithstanding, would not have been fitting either, said Wan Ying, an associate teacher of the study of disease transmission at Columbia University and a creator of the paper on New York City flu mortality. More contamination could likewise prompt more transformation, so that could create another infection variation that can then disintegrate your earlier insusceptibility, so it's an interaction relying upon how the infection will develop, which is truly flighty, Yang said. This 2005 electron magnifying lens picture made accessible by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention shows remade 1918 flu virions that were gathered from a 1918 cell culture. Cynthia Goldsmith/CDC/AP, flu infections and COVIDs are hereditarily unique, so it's impractical to make a balanced correlation with the 1918 pandemic. Yang noticed that the novel COVID seems to change far quicker than the 1918 flu infection. The executives of the flu pandemic additionally had profited from numerous logical advancements that were not accessible a century prior, including more sterile medical clinic conditions, better admittance to clean water, and, maybe what is generally outstanding, an antibody. Required inoculation for the military, as American as George Washington. In any case, we can get a brief look into our future by taking a gander at the past. The 1918 seasonal infection, subsequent to waiting in a dangerous structure for over 2 years, at last became milder. Presently it is important for each occasional influenza we have, said Anne Reed, the chief head of the National Center for Science Education, who aided succession the genome of the 1918 flu infection during the 1990s. Her exploration observed that a few hereditary parts of the 1918 infection kept on being available in new episodes, remembering pandemics for 1957 and 1968. Individuals with invulnerability to the 1918 infection were accordingly liable to have a few insurances from its hereditary cousins. Ultimately, Everybody on the planet will have some base degree of insusceptibility to this COVID, so in any event, when it transforms into another strain, individuals will not be no doubt helpless against it, Reid said. All that we can expect with the current pandemic is a development that is like seasonal infections. I believe it will remain, Yang said of the novel COVID. I don't think disposal is plausible or even reasonable now. Ideally, we can live more calmly with this infection. As the world enters the third year of the COVID pandemic, individuals wonder when and how it will end. History offers significant examples. Happiness /The Washington Post. Don't forget to like our video.